we've talked a lot about blood flow, and we've talked a lot about blood resistance and heart rate. We've talked a lot about heart rate and heartbeats. Now let's talk a little bit about hemodynamics. So hemodynamics is essentially the study of blood and the relationships that blood specifically has with pressure, flow, and resistance. Fluid dynamics is another term. It's just that hemodynamics specifically applies to blood specifically, right? Blood, hemodynamics, blood dynamics. So there's two principal components of blood. We're going to have plasma, which is the liquidy stuff, and then we're going to have blood cells, which is our white blood cells, our red blood cells, and our platelets. If anyone's ever spun blood down in a centrifuge, you see that you get three different layers, essentially. You get what's called an RBC pack, and in that RBC pack is where you're going to get red blood cells and platelets. The next little layer above that, it's kind of this like cloudy, milky, foggy section, and it kind of looks wispy like a cloud. And that's going to actually be your white blood cells. That's called your buffy coat. And then the layer of yellow above that, as you spin out the blood, is going to actually be your plasma. That's the fluid portion of the blood. The viscosity of that blood is going to determine the flow rate of that blood. So the greater the viscosity, the harder to flow, the greater the resistance to flow. Think of it like pouring oil versus water. Something that I didn't mention is that hematocrit is actually the percentage of blood that's comprised of cells relative to the plasma. So hematocrit is something that as you get more trained, you can adjust hematocrit, and training at altitude adjust hematocrit. And we'll talk about that one of the last couple of weeks of the semester, actually. Super big slide. What I want you to pay attention to in the top left is imagine that the heart is a pump in a closed system. You guys got that? Good. We're going to have a left atrium and a left ventricle. Left atrium and the left ventricle pump blood to the system. Right atrium and right ventricle return blood back to the heart, right? Like that's how we're getting blood out to the lungs. So imagine that we have a high pressure, 85 millimeters of mercury outside of the lungs, or outside of the aorta, and then we have a pressure of 0 millimeters of mercury at the right atria. Just like we have concentration gradients, we're going to have pressure gradients. We're going to move from high to low pressure. Just like the way we breathe is going to be bringing air from high to low. We're doing the same thing here. We're moving blood from high to low pressures. The blood flow is directly proportional to the pressure difference across the system. So as you increase the pressure gradient, you increase the flow rate. Where things get different is with resistance to flow. And we can actually adjust resistance to flow based off of length, based off viscosity of the tube or the vasculature in this case, as well as the radius of the tube or the vasculature in this case. So if we look over here on the bottom left, we'll see that we have an original flow rate of 100 centimeters cubed per second, right? Just a random number. Don't pay attention to the units. I don't want you guys to really stress over that. 100 cubic centimeters per second. If we double the length, then we double the time that it takes for it to get from one area to the other. So we cut the flow in half, right? So we double the length, it becomes 50 centimeters cubed per second, cubic centimeters per second. If we double the viscosity, so we make it a little bit more like oil and a little bit less like water, we're going to slow it down again. If we double the pressure, then we dramatically double, or we expectedly double the flow rate, right? If we double the pressure, we double the flow rate. Pressure is directly related to the flow. If we double the radius, however, look at what happens. There's a dramatic change in flow rate by doubling the radius. If we reduce the radius, we get a dramatic reduction in flow rate. The same thing happens. And that's, if you look at this equation over here on the right-hand side, you can see that length and viscosity are direct, right? They're not direct. They're proportionally related to the resistance. However, radius is not proportional, right? It's nonlinear. It's quadratic. It's to the fourth degree. It's raised to the fourth. So that means that for every small change, there's a huge outcome difference. Make sense? So as we go through the vascular system, I showed you that original picture, closed system. We go from the arteries to the arterioles, arterioles to the capillaries, capillaries to the venules, venules to the veins. As we go through that system, we get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Our blood tissue length is not changing. It's a closed system, right? Our blood tissue length is generally not going to change. The viscosity of the blood's not really going to change either. Unless you're injecting oil straight into your veins, you're not going to have that dramatic of a change. Your hematocrite's not going to change dramatically overnight unless you infuse someone else's blood into you, which cyclists do. That leaves us with really just dilation and constriction that's going to control the majority of the way that blood flows through our body. And what I want you to see over here on the left-hand side is that the area for the greatest decrease in pressure is from the arterioles through to the capillaries, right? We're going from approximately 75 millimeters of mercury all the way down to about 35 millimeters of mercury at the end of the arterioles. And then at the end of the capillaries, we're way down here, right? So we're able to actually dramatically adjust the pressure of blood changes based on how we divert blood and how we control and restrict vessels. So let's take this just a little bit further, right? Let's go just one little step further. If we are dramatically changing the flow rates and dramatically changing resistance to flow based on dilations or constrictions, how do you think we change oxygen delivery during exercise, right? So first step, during exercise, we know that we need more oxygen. We know that our muscles need more oxygen. Otherwise, we're going to be in that glycolytic state and we're going to be burning through energy sources fast. We transport oxygen in blood. So we know that we have to get blood to the working tissue because we have to get oxygen to the working tissue. So we have to increase cardiac output, and then we also have to redistribute blood flow to the working organs, to the working muscles. We have to actually take and constrict in certain places and restrict blood flow to certain places, such as the gut and the organs that aren't really working. And then we have to vasodilate and open arteries and open arterioles and open capillaries so that we can actually direct blood flow to the area that it needs to be going to. So just by changing the muscle tone around our vascular system, we're actually able to shunt and control blood flow throughout the system so that we match energetic demands with oxygen levels. So how do we expect cardiac output to change based on exercise status? How do we expect cardiac output to change based on exercise intensity? Well, if cardiac output is a product of heart rate and stroke volume, then we would expect to see an increase in cardiac output as exercise progresses. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So we see that as exercise increases, the metabolic rate increases, the cardiac output also increases to match that, to match the oxygen demand, to match the ATP demand. We're actually going to have an increase in cardiac output. As we're redirecting blood flow, we're going to have to be increasing our cardiac output to be matching the needs of the activity, to be matching the muscular needs. Now, most of this is going to be, most of the stuff we're going to be talking about is upright exercise. Most of the stuff we're going to always talk about is upright exercise, and most of it's going to be applied to endurance exercise training because most of the research has been done in these avenues. And in order to understand different physiology, in order to understand non-normal physiology, you have to understand normal physiology first. So during upright exercise, you can expect to see that an untrained individual stroke volume will increase 40 to 60%, right? So as they increase in exercise, their stroke volume will increase up to about 40 to 60% of their VO2 max. Not really massive. And what that means is that in order to continue to match cardiac output, their heart rate has to continue to increase. Whereas high-level runners and elite-level endurance athletes don't have that same plateauing effect for their stroke volume. So we can actually continue to increase stroke volume and maintain heart rate or keep heart rate a little bit lower in order to maintain or increase cardiac output. And there's a couple of reasons for this. We're not really positive why it happens, but one hypothesis is that the exercise heart rates required are lower in endurance-trained athletes, and they can actually have an artificial dropping of their max heart rate because of their training status. And one of the ways that they can offset that is with increasing their stroke volume. Another thing is that as you increase in age, you also decrease your max heart rate, so you have to compensate by increasing your stroke volume. When we start talking about O2 exchange and oxygen exchange at the muscle tissue and trained versus untrained differences and changes in cardiac output and how it affects changes in metabolism and how it affects oxygen delivery to tissues, we also have to talk about this concept of AVO2 differences, or AV diffs. Essentially what an AVO2 difference is it's the difference in oxygen across the capillary beds. So it's the difference in oxygen at the arteries, in the arterioles versus the venules in the veins. So let's say that we have essentially 100 mLs of oxygen here, and then over on the other side, we have 10 mLs of oxygen. Essentially, the AVO2 difference would be 90, right? So we'd have a difference, we'd have a dramatic difference between the veins and the arteries, and that's what we want. We want to increase the AVO2 difference, because when we increase the AVO2 difference, we're actually favoring oxygen offloading. So what you'd expect to see from working tissue and working muscle is a higher AVO2 difference than non-working tissue. And that's what essentially what the Fick equation is trying to tell us. And this is another super important equation for you. And that's essentially that volume of oxygen consumed and utilized, their VO2 or the V.O2 or the VO2 peak, however you want to think about it, is going to be equal to their cardiac output times their AVO2 difference. So what the heart is able to pump through the body times how much of that blood pumped is able to carry oxygen and transport oxygen and be actually used at the tissue and taken up at the tissue level, right? It's essentially all that the Fick is doing is giving you a way to calculate VO2 max and giving you the physiology behind the VO2 max, which is cardiac output and oxygen offloading. We already kind of talked about this a little bit. Essentially, in order to match blood flow to working muscles, we're going to redistribute blood flow. It's going to change based on the size of the muscle groups that are going to be working, what muscle groups are going to be working, and whether or not you're eating or not eating. This is actually one reason for my runners. This is actually one reason why you get upset stomachs and you can have stomach cramping when you're eating and consuming liquids while you're working out or while you're on a run. It's because you're shunting blood away from the GI tract and toward the working muscles instead of moving blood for digestion. And that's essentially what you're seeing here with this diagram, right? So on the top, the pink exercise, you're seeing a heavy exercise load. You can see that we're actually changing the level of blood flow. We're actually 80 to 85% of blood flow is coming to the muscles, or of cardiac output is moving towards the muscles compared to 15 to 20%. And what's going to be a shocking number for you is that these numbers are going to be dramatically different than these numbers, right? What I want you to think about, though, is that this is a percentage of cardiac output, and that percentage of cardiac output changes the total volume because the cardiac output is multiplied by 5 here. So you can actually take and multiply the brain flow by 5 here and see why there's really a maintenance of blood flow going to the brain, but there's a dramatic increase in blood flow going to the muscle, right? Our brain needs a very specific amount of blood, and that's why it's still able to maintain its blood flow rate. The heart's still maintaining it because we have to make sure that we maintain blood flow to the heart, or else we have heart attacks and we die. We've already really talked about this slide. I don't feel like harping on it anymore for you guys. If you want it, it's here. If you need more reading on it, it's all here for you. Something to also think about is like anticipatory effects of exercise, how heart rate response and circulatory response to exercise can be manipulated based on emotional state. If you're nervous before a game, your heart rate's going to be a little bit elevated, and that means that your submaximal heart rate and blood pressure are usually going to be a little bit higher. Your feelings and ratings of perceived exertion might be a little bit higher too, but when you start doing maximal exercise, there's really no difference that's going to be observed. In the rest to exercise transition, we're going to see that heart rate and stroke volume and cardiac output, as long as it's steady work rates, you're going to have a stabilization of heart rate and stroke volume and cardiac output. So you're going to actually match the work rate with the cardiac output, right? Nothing novel here, just it's providing you a little bit of a mechanism for why we saw the things that we saw with energetics, right? With the bioenergetics system and what we're going to be fueling the body with. And this is how we're fueling the body. When it comes to incremental or graded exercise tests or VO2 max tests or stage tests, you're going to actually have an increasing of heart rate and cardiac output in proportion to the oxygen uptake. The blood flow to the muscles is also going to increase in relation to that same work rate. But then the cardiac output and heart rate actually reach a plateau at 100% VO2 max. And that makes sense because we're at a max consumption and max utilization rate. We cannot push blood faster through the system. We can't gain oxygen faster. We can't offload oxygen faster. So our body's not going to be able to work any faster because it's already at its max level. Now, what about the difference between arm exercise versus leg exercise? And this is going to be a little bit counterintuitive at first, but actually at the arm exercise level, heart rate and blood pressure are usually significantly higher than they are with leg exercise. And you're sitting there thinking, man, but legs, like training legs is so much worse than training arms. This is going to be a little bit different because it's going to be endurance-based activity too. So think about an arm crank versus being on a bike. The reason that this is the case is think about the muscle shunting or the blood flow shunting to the muscles. Your legs are a large system. Your legs are a large blood flow system, and a large volume of blood is delivered to your legs. So if you're doing arm exercise, you don't need that blood volume to your legs. You need it to your upper arms. So you're going to actually increase the blood pressure in the heart. In the heart, the venous return to the heart is not going to have to travel as far from the legs, from the toes to the heart. It's going to stay in the upper thoracic torso. So it's actually going to be able to cycle back faster and increase the blood pressure and increase the heart rate. When it comes to things like intermittent exercise or high intensity interval training or CrossFit or whatever you're thinking for intermittent round-based exercise, boxing, jiu-jitsu, I can name a ton now that I'm thinking about it. Essentially, the heart rate recovery and the cardiac output are going to change based on the number of intervals that you're doing and the duration of the intermittency throughout the exercise. If you're doing heavy and intense interval training, your heart rate and your cardiac output could be as high, if not higher, than you would normally get with graded exercise or steady state exercise. The difference is going to be that as you continue those exercise durations, as you continue those exercise intervals, the heart rate recovery that you would normally expect to see in the rest periods is going to diminish. So let's say you're working at 180 beats per minute, which is really hard exercise, and you're able to maintain that 180 beats per minute for every single workload. Your rest periods, your heart rate might recover down to 120, and then might be like 122, and then 124, and then 130, and then 140. So that those rest periods, your heart rate is not dropping as far as it did initially. You're not recovering as much as you did initially. And that's essentially what's going on with cardiac output during intermittent exercise, is that you're struggling to keep up, and your cardiac output staying higher and higher and higher and higher as those intervals continue. During prolonged exercise, think about this as running a marathon or running an ultramarathon or exercising for long durations in the heat. Essentially, cardiac output is going to be maintained. Q is going to equal HR times SV. At some point during that prolonged exercise, as the duration continues to increase and as the distance continues to increase and the mileage continues to compound, your stroke volume is going to actually begin to decrease some. So the amount of blood that you're forcing out of the heart is going to decrease some. In order to maintain that cardiac output, because you're still working at constant work rate, your heart rate has to make up the slack. So you'll actually see that exercise for prolonged durations, you'll start at one heart rate for a threshold or for a plateau, and then as that exercise continues, you'll see that it increases and increases and increases. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's that the heart rate is being increased due to rising body temperatures. There's also a big thing and a big reason why you're seeing changes in stroke volume is that you're actually losing plasma volume due to sweat losses. So where I said that it's a closed system, during prolonged exercise, you're actually going to be manipulating that volume of blood based on sweat losses as well. So you're going to actually be having to, like, your stroke volume is going to be adjusted because you're losing volume of blood. So it was a lot this week. I apologize. Let's just take a second and breathe, right? Let your heart beat. This physiology it's complex. It can be a lot. You guys have it. I promise you do. Return everything back to how does the heart function? How does the heart beat? And then start thinking logically. If we know we need oxygen for energetics, if we know we need oxygen for this, how is our body going to make sure that we're getting that? And usually the answer is the correct answer. Usually the things that you can come up with for how our body would match that demand is going to be the correct answer. All right? Cool. On to next week, guys.